Okay, everyone. Welcome. I might just stop sharing my screen for a moment so I can see everyone just for a moment. Thank you for joining me this evening. And thank you for doing that third quiz. I was looking at the results as they were, as people were completing it. Just let me do a reload, because there were a few who just reloading the page. We have an honour board, an informal one. So far, we've got 5 students who have got full marks for all 3 quizzes so far. So I think they deserve significant congratulations. I won't give their names for fear of embarrassing them, though they shouldn't be embarrassed, they should be proud. And there's another sort of maybe 15 or 20 students who have gotten actually probably more than that. It's looking like there might be maybe 30 students who have got more than 90% so far across the quizzes. So I think they're doing very well. If I just very quickly bring up the stats for this week. This week the statistics, just calculating them, I'll tell you right now what the average was. 79%. So this was either you're getting smarter, you can get smarter, maybe you're studying better, or the quiz was a little bit easier this week, because I think last week the average might have been 69%, this week it's 79%. And it was a little bit quicker as well, I think. So we're doing very well. So anyway, this week, let me share my screen and bring up the slides, and we'll kick things off for this week. Share screen 1. Okay, so I don't know whether you've been noticing or not, but each week on the opening slide, apart from the reminder about the quiz, just can't imagine anyone will be forgetting after or by week 4. I'll leave that there. But I also put up a quote that relates to the week's lecture in some way, usually just to try to get you thinking. And so, as it kind of implies there, this week we're going to be talking about information. I'll be doing the first half, and then I can see Glenn has already joined us. Welcome, Glenn. Glenn will be talking to us in the second half of this evening, and hopefully, as in most weeks, taking my kind of miscellaneous ramblings and turning them into something that makes much more sense. So, this week, as it says on there, I want to talk about finding and trusting information. The kind of a quick overview. Actually, one thing that's worth kind of, I think, commenting on is this week and next week kind of form a matching pair. So this week we're talking about information sources and understanding and trusting information that you do find. Next week, we're going to be talking about research, and in some respects, that also kind of relates to information, different sort of information, and how you use it. But the two things are quite tightly interwoven, so you should see some fairly significant connections between the 2 weeks. And then next week, we'll also be saying how you use research in the. I'll talk about it both in a general sense, but also in a specific sense about what it means in terms of IT projects. And you'll see more about that next week. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So this week, I want to talk about information, types of information, where you find it, the role of it, whether you can trust it or not, etc. I'll give a whole lot of other bits of context, and then Glenn will drill that down into something much more practical and focused. And then at the very end, as usual, there's a few reminders. In particular, I want to say some things about the project now that almost everyone has sorted out their topics. So, information. I think where I wanted to start was kind of sources of information. You've got, on that, as that quote at the beginning said, there is a flood of information that's become much more so over the last 30 years. The internet was kind of very early bits of the the internet dates back to the 1960s. The World Wide Web, which is kind of an information source built on top of the internet, dates back to the early 1990s. So we're now around 30 years old in terms of the World Wide Web. Commercially, probably 2 or 3 or 4 years younger than that. But so we've had a quarter of a century of having access to an incredible source of information. And as that quote said, getting information off the internet is a bit like trying to take a drink from a fire hose. You've just got this enormous flood of information. But if I kind of go back prior to that and think about sources of information, typically they came from books, journals, etc. And they have remained kind of a dominant source of information for academic writing. And I'll come back to that later on about why that's the case. But increasingly, we've now got access to a huge range of other non-print sources, recordings, broadcasts, transcripts, and particularly internet sites. And all of those provide us with information. And a crucial skill is being able to interpret that, make sense of it, know when to trust it, know what it means, etc. So, actually, I might ask you, I keep forgetting to try to make this more interactive. So can I ask you to post into the chat, where's my chat window gone? That's my chat window. Can you post in the chat? I can't find it. There it is. It was hidden behind my other screen. So, can I ask you to post into the chat places where you think you can find information? I want to see what you come up with. Google. Sort of. I'll come back to Google in a moment. Google Scholar, yeah. Wikipedia, absolutely. Where else? Stack Overflow, school libraries, uni libraries, people, absolutely. We're talking about information right at the moment. Experts, you go and ask someone who hopefully is an expert. One of the students has said, Ji Wang, other particular people, peers, other students, social media. Yeah, absolutely. I think the very first one that came up was Google. And the reason I wanted to kind of come back to that was because Google isn't a source of information, it is a tool for locating possible sources of information. So Google's just a search engine, so it doesn't directly provide information. Well, sorry, Google does provide some bits of information, but mostly it's a search tool that tells you where you can find information. So it's kind of gone and indexed as much as it possibly can, and so you then use it to locate it. So Google itself isn't a source of information, it's a tool to help you find sources of information. But I guess one of the key things is understanding what information is, and mostly what you were describing was really kind of, or in many cases, data. So I wanted to give you a differentiation and get you thinking about what the difference is between data, information, knowledge, wisdom. So data is essentially raw, recorded facts. You can see a picture of a tomato there. But even the fact that I have said it's a tomato has required some interpretation by me. That picture purely is data. There's nothing there that says that it's a tomato. That's just my interpretation. Almost certainly is. But all I can see there is a round red object with some stem and I think they're leaves. What are the bits called that were surrounding it when it was first fruiting? Can't remember the name of the those elements. But so the data there is that picture of a particular object. As soon as I take that data and put it into some sort of context, start to interpret it, I'm converting that data into information, and mostly that will be fairly straightforward. Sometimes you get it wrong, and I'll come back to that a little bit this week, but also next week in terms of misinterpretation of data. And so information is really taking data, systematizing it, interpreting it, and putting it into a context. In this case, my context is that I know a whole lot about, I've eaten tomatoes, I've bought them, I've got some sitting in my refrigerator at the moment. And so I'm taking existing knowledge that I have and putting that data into the context of that knowledge that allows me to extract meaning from it. In this case, the meaning is that round red object is a tomato. Tomato, if you say tomato or tomato. Anyway, you can then go a step further and add to that additional information that gives you some form of, business sense, competitive advantage. In a personal sense, some sort of additional insight into it. And so some people, often tomatoes are thought of as being a vegetable. They're not. They're the product of a flowering plant, and they have seeds. I think there's some botanical kind of definition of what the difference between a vegetable and a fruit is. And strictly speaking, a tomato is actually fruit, not a vegetable. And that means that I can, I'm drawing on additional information that adds further meaning to that object, so that I'm extending it in some way. So I can look at that and say, oh, that's a tomato. Oh, and I know that a tomato is a fruit. You can go one step further and add kind of the concept of wisdom to that. This is less well defined. Wisdom is about making sense out of that and being able to interpret it kind of at a higher level. So even though a tomato is a fruit, wisdom is knowing that you don't put it in a fruit salad. So you kind of get those layers of meaning that you're drawing. You go from data, which is just raw facts, through to information, which is raw facts in context, to knowledge, which is an interpretation of that, to wisdom, which is making sense of it and using it in insightful, good ways, etc. And so you get this kind of important hierarchy. And so one of the key things to remember is that data is not the same as knowledge. You look on the internet, you'll find lots of bits of data, but how you then turn that into information, and ideally into knowledge that gives you lets you make use of it, is important. And yes, tomatoes do taste good. Just looking at the chat window, tomatoes do taste good in salad, but probably not a fruit salad. I wouldn't put a tomato in a salad with banana and peaches and grapes and fruits. I'd put it in a salad with lettuce and whatever else. I guess, maybe there are people who disagree with that, different tastes, I guess. So you get that kind of that hierarchy from data upwards. So let me move to something a little more practical and talk about what that means in terms of the sort of data or information or knowledge that you need in different cases, particularly if I put this in the context of this unit and the focus on IT systems and projects, etc. So you can get different levels of information. So you can get information that is narrow and specific and technical. So, I'm trying to manage a Git repository for version control of my documents, and I can't remember how to do a merge. How do I do that? And so I might go and look that up on, do a Google search, find something on Stack Overflow that tells me, here's the relevant command and the the relevant flags on that command to do a merge into both a local or a remote Git repository. So you've got kind of an immediate, narrow technical need, something I need to do now, and it's a specific technical question. And so something like that is kind of that fairly narrow piece of data. Here's the command, here's what you do with it, etc. You can get things that are like that and immediate, but are broader, and kind of relate to kind of a broader question, rather than just a specific fact. What's the command I use? You get something that isn't a single fact, but a kind of a collection of pieces of information. So you're all used to using Ed now for the discussion forums for this unit. And if I might be working for the university when they first decided to use Ed, and they sort of said, oh, well, we've got Ed, but we want to be able to integrate it into Canvas so that when you log into Canvas, you can open up Ed without having to log into it separately. Or even, or at least to have for Ed to know who's allowed to access which units on Ed. So, gee, that means I've got Canvas, I've got Ed. There's some issue around the technical integration of those, setting up an appropriate LTI interface, or whatever it is. How do I configure that, etc. So that's not just a single fact. It's a kind of a collection of them, and maybe even a little bit broader. Here are the hiccups. So these are kind of configurations where it may or may not work. If you set up Canvas in this way, then you probably need to do this in Ed. You could do it in these two different ways. Both would work, but one might be more have better performance in terms of the way it manages it. One might give, you can configure it so that you can do an update from Canvas to Ed in terms of the accounts on a 5-minute basis, an hourly basis, or a daily basis. And if you do it on every day, then it means that if someone enrolls in the unit to get access to Canvas, it might take a day for them to get access to Ed. But that might be easier in terms of the performance load on the system. So there'll be kind of you've still got a technical issue about a particular problem, but you're adding kind of that broader elements into it that require a degree of interpretation at a technical level. And the reason why that kind of becomes significant is because once you start doing that, you start crossing over into, well, which is more important for students? Is it to have it updated in Ed sooner, or is it to, once you're in Ed, for it to be performing more efficiently? And so you start to kind of connect into those contextual elements, and the context in this case is about business or the way in which the business is operating, and therefore what you want from your users. So as soon as you get out of that kind of narrow, immediate technical question, you straight away start to have issues around interpreting that information within the context you're operating in. You can have things that aren't about an immediate technical need. I need to integrate Ed into Canvas. How do I do that? Into something about, we're thinking about doing this. What are the options? I'm involved in a new small not-for-profit technology startup company that's doing outreach to teaching computing in high schools, and that company's just been set up in the last month and a half. It was a spin-off from a centre within the university. Now that it's a separate independent company, it's got to put in place all its own infrastructure. And one of the questions that we're asking is, we want kind of an operating platform that gives us a whole lot of tools. Do we use G Suite or Office 365? Actually, both of those names have now changed. Google, what's G Suite called? It's called Google something. And Office 365 has changed its name to Microsoft 365, I think. But most people still use those names. So I'm sitting here thinking, oh, I could use this platform, I could use that platform. Which one's better? One might give me more functionality, one might give better kind of support from the vendor, one might be cheaper, but less functional. So I start to kind of be looking for information about comparing those options and capabilities. So I'm not looking for, unlike the first two examples, I'm not looking for a specific example. I'm not saying, what's the command to merge Git do a merge into a Git repository, or even what's the technical approach to integrating it into Canvas. It's saying, I'm thinking about doing this. What are the options, and how do I make a choice? And so I'm looking for information that helps me make that choice. And as soon as we're now at a level where it has become so contextualized that you are unlikely to find, highly, almost to the point of impossibility, but not quite, highly unlikely to find a specific answer. So if I was to Google, I'm a small company, should I use G Suite or Office 365? I'll get lots of opinions, and I might get some comparison sites and some facts about the performance of them, but I won't get an answer. I will have to take that information, distill it, analyze it, and come up with an answer myself. So you kind of move into a realm where the information sources provide you with parts of the picture, but it requires you to do the integration and analysis and to come up with a conclusion. That example was still about technical possibilities. What are the capabilities of those two platforms? Next level up from that is when you start sort of going beyond just technical comparisons to kind of the business value. We're a small company. We're a company that sells or does maintenance on people's swimming pools. I think I might have put this example in Ed. And we've been operating for the last 20 years. We've got lots of customers, but 20 years ago they were originally just on a piece of card, we had a person in the office who would go through those cards each month and say, oh, who do we need to contact to come in, or whose pool should we be going and doing maintenance on in the next week? Who should we sort of be chasing? Oh, this person hasn't contacted us for a while. Maybe we can give them a call. And maybe we've kind of added a little bit of technology somewhere along the line. So instead of being on written cards, it's now in a spreadsheet, so that we can kind of analyze it a little bit better. But now we've sort of said, my son was enrolled in an IT course, and the owner of the company might be saying, oh, my son's enrolled in a first year of an IT course, and someone told him about this thing called a CRM system. I wonder whether that would be helpful to us. So if we put that in, what would it involve? So in other words, that question about adding value, what does it cost? Not just the cost of buying the product or paying a consultant to put it in place for us, but also the cost in terms of changed business processes. We might have had a person in our company who's been managing that spreadsheet for the last 10 years, and they know how to do it, but they're not very technically literate, and they don't want to change. And so if we try to put a CRM system in, they might just say, no, I can't cope, and quit. And that might be a good thing, or it might be a bad thing. It might mean we lose a whole lot of corporate knowledge. It may be good because we can get someone else. So there's kind of broader business costs as well. And so we've got this whole kind of question about not just is it technically feasible, and is G Suite or Office 365 a better technical solution? But does it make sense from a business perspective, and what value is added to our business of implementing a system like this? So you've kind of got that level, and that requires an even higher degree of interpretation because the circumstances in each organisation are so unique. And then the fifth category there is about kind of prospective things, saying, well, we're not adding a CRM system, but maybe our competitor is. Is it something that, is there something we can leapfrog in terms of doing something else? Will technical solutions that we're putting in place still be relevant in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years? Or will there be something that comes along that undermines my business? Is the fact that there's another company just down the road who does pool maintenance, but they've got an Internet of Things set of devices that they put in your pool that measure the chemical balance and send data back to their company so that they don't need to turn up and do any work on it until they get a kind of information from their wireless chemical analysis tool. And so being able to understand the technology that's available, what that might mean, not just directly for, is it useful for us, but is it changing the environment that we're operating in, and how will that work? So for something like that, there's kind of that broader domain evolution information. And you won't get that by saying, typing into Google. Well, you might in some cases, but mostly typing into Google, will my pool business, what are the things that are going to impact on my pool business in the next 5 years? I should have typed that into Google before the lecture to see whether it came up with anything sensible. I suspect not. And so with that type of change, you basically need to kind of be on top of the way in which the field is evolving. And that means reading broadly, understanding the nature of change in the field. So that's kind of this broad set of changes, types of information, and levels of information. And so as we kind of went up that list, the information became more general. It started off being very specific. This is the command to do a merge into a Git repository, through to really general. These are the sorts of technologies that are emerging over the next 10 years and might impact on businesses in different ways. And the context became increasingly important. Doing a merge into a Git repository, the command for that, is almost entirely context independent. It's you do this and it'll do a merge on your Git repository. Whereas as you went down that list, context became increasingly important. Why is that significant? This is kind of an interesting graph. It shows BlackBerry, then the market share held by BlackBerry between 2007 and 2016. Hopefully most of you have heard of BlackBerry. For those of you who haven't, it's what it looks like there. It was kind of an early kind of smart device, had a very particular kind of look about it. The business model around it was very particular. It was fairly specific, in that you had a BlackBerry device that was connected, use their network, or use their back-end functionality in very specific ways. And they were incredibly successful for a certain amount of time. As you can see there, they had 20% of the smartphone OS market at one point, and they were kind of almost the device of choice in business contexts. Not really in individual personal ones, but certainly in the business context, they were very dominant, and they basically disappeared. As that graph shows, their market share just disappeared because they didn't understand the way in which that particular market was evolving, the way in which technology was occurring, the fact that mobile phones and smartphones were providing types of functionality that people wanted that BlackBerry didn't provide, and the sort of functionality that BlackBerry did provide was becoming less meaningful, and they just didn't understand that kind of technological shift, and therefore they didn't understand what it meant for their business, and you can kind of see the result of that. So I've been using the word context a fair bit, so I wanted to kind of come back to that because it is important. There's a definition there that sort of says context is basically the circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement or idea and in which it can be fully understood. So in other words, it's the kind of information around the focus of, if you've got a bit of data, the context is the things that kind of surround that and help you make sense of it in some way, that are basically support the interpretation of it. I don't know how many of you will be familiar with the particular metaphor that is shown in there, but there's a story about a number of blind men, that's rather sexist, blind people who came across an elephant, and they were trying to work out what it was, and different of them kind of felt in different parts of it, and because they were blind they only saw that part of it, and so one of them kind of felt the tail and thought they had found a rope, one of them sort of found the leg and thought it was a tree, and one of them found the trunk and thought it was a snake. In other words, each of them came to a flawed conclusion, not a flawed conclusion, a wrong conclusion about what they had found, because they couldn't see the whole thing. They didn't have that kind of broader context to understand it. And that means you either they needed to either be able to see and therefore see the whole thing and therefore interpret the bit that they were engaging with, or they needed to be able to work collectively to combine those bits of information and say, oh, we're all feeling a different thing. We've got bits that feel like a rope and a wall and a fan and a spear and a snake and a tree. What could this be? Something that has all of those sorts of things. So context is crucial to kind of interpreting information. And so if you go back to that slide, as you go down that list, having clarity about your context becomes increasingly important. Understanding, if you look at that fourth one down, the business value, if you don't understand your business, then you can't understand and the way in which your business works. And not just, we're a pool maintenance company, but we're a pool maintenance company that operates with a spreadsheet, and a person who manages that spreadsheet has been doing it for 10 years and they're not all that confident in actually changing. That kind of level of understanding of the way in which your business operates is kind of important to that provides that context to understanding whether a CRM would add value or not, and whether or not the cost of adding that value, i.e. having the person who currently manages it being uncomfortable with it or not being able to, is important to interpreting it. So that kind of comes back to that question about the circumstances that let you interpret the information. So if you think about that in the context of your project, or related to your project, what's the context of your project? How does the business really work? Where are the things that are difficult? How is it managed? So that when you start saying, oh, we're putting this technology in, what are the elements that let you interpret how successful that technology might be and what might be needed to make it successful? So let me ask a little bit about sources of information. You get ones that are very general, Wikipedia. You get things that provide technical content, but not necessarily interpretation of it. So something like W3 Schools, if you haven't had a look at that, maybe go and kind of look at that site. It's basically kind of like a encyclopedia of technologies related to the World Wide Web, hence W3 schools. And so, it's kind of good as a reference source for that. So it's about technical content. So if I wanted to say, what are the attributes that I can add to a heading tag in an HTML file? I can go and look it up in there. Then you get technical support sites like Stack Overflow, where you can sort of say, I'm trying to work out, why my LTI interface between Canvas and Ed isn't working. I've configured it this way. Has anyone got any suggestions of things I could try? So you kind of get that technical support. Then you get business sites like Gartner, which do all sorts of interesting analysis. And then you get research sites like the ACM, Digital Library, that DL.ACM is the Digital Library of the Association of Computing Machinery. So that has basically large collections of journals, and those journals obviously have journal papers in them. And so there's kind of a question about what differentiates those different sources. They're obviously different types of information, but there's also a significant difference in terms of their reliability. So if I, let me talk a little bit about reliability versus validity. The difference between those is important. You can have information that is reliable and not valid, and you can have information that is unreliable but still valid. There's a URL there for a site that would be important for you to go and have a look at. It talks about the difference between reliability and validity. Reliability is it's slightly more complex than this, but put simply, reliability is about the consistency of the data. So, in other words, if I was to go and ask 50 people a particular question, and 49 out of the 50 told me the same answer, then that has significant reliability. In other words, I can rely on a particular answer. And that sometimes, maybe even most times, might mean that it's correct, but not always. And so validity is that answer valid? Is it correct? So you can have sources of information that are reliable. In other words, wherever you look, you will get that same answer. But they can be incorrect for one reason or another. You can also get information that is unreliable. In other words, I go and look at this, go and ask a bunch of people for a particular answer, and I get different answers, which means that any one of them might be unreliable, but it might be correct. So it's important that you differentiate between the reliability of information and validity. And often people use the word reliable when what they really mean is valid. And there's a couple of other kind of interesting sources there about what makes for credible sources, etc. So I mentioned those 5 sites before. I'd like to do a poll. Let me launch a poll. Here we go. There's 2 questions for you to answer. Can you tell me which one of those 5 sites you think is the most reliable? And then which one do you think is the most unreliable? Okay, there's 200 people online. I've got 25 responses so far. 50 responses. People are now thinking about it. Yeah, this is interesting. I've got almost 100 responses, so about half of you have voted so far. I want to get to 150. I want at least 3/4 of you voting. 120 of you have voted. oh, come on. There's still 40% of you who are sitting there thinking, I'm not sure, so I'm not going to vote. It's anonymous, so I can't see what you're saying, which means you can safely vote. I've got 2/3. Okay, I might. Come on. I need 11 more people. I want to get to 150. Come on, you need to participate. You need to be engaged. 141. People who have voted are waiting for those who haven't to vote. Okay, no, 142. Someone else. 143, 44. Okay, I'm not going to get to 150. Oh, I might. 145. 6, 7. I need 3 more, 2 more. Come on, 2 more votes. 1 more vote. There we go. 150. That'll do. End polling. Share the results. Okay, so you should now be able to see those results. That's really interesting. The top answer for what's the most reliable is Wikipedia. The top answer for what's the most unreliable is Wikipedia. That sort of kind of suggests that maybe we don't really know. If I had to say which of those was the most reliable, I would have probably said the ACM. That's a journal site, digital library of the ACM. The reason I would argue that that's the most reliable is that articles in journals and most conferences go through a peer review process, which means people write them, they analyse data, they then get peer reviewed, and if the data hasn't been analysed and managed properly, the paper won't be accepted. So I would have thought that the ACM site was the most reliable. That doesn't mean it's necessarily the most useful, because it tends to be fairly specific in most cases, and the top types of things that get discussed in there are about kind of cutting edge research rather than practical, how do I do this type stuff. So there's a difference between reliability and kind of immediate usefulness. I was surprised that there weren't more people who said Gartner was reliable. One of the, Gartner is certainly often opinion pieces, but they're almost always highly informed opinion pieces. It doesn't have that kind of same peer review process as kind of the journals managed by the ACM. But Gartner's business value is built on business trusting that their information is correct. It's kind of a core to their business, and if they weren't seen as reliable, their business would fall apart. Stack Overflow is often unreliable, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's not useful. And likewise, W3 Schools tends to be fairly fact-based, and therefore that tends to make it kind of add a degree of reliability to it. Stack Overflow is an interesting example because it is opinion-based. You post a question saying, "Oh, what do you think of this? How do I do that?" And you will get a wide range of different responses. And so the data can be unreliable, but if you know that it's unreliable, you can treat it accordingly. So unreliability isn't necessarily a bad thing, provided you know that it's unreliable and therefore you need to use judgment in interpreting it. The one that surprised me the most there was Wikipedia. It's often seen as being unreliable and can be because it is kind of open source editing of it. But it kind of almost uses the wisdom of crowds type approach. It basically sort of says we've got a huge audience and a huge set of people editing it, and therefore in some respects it becomes self-correcting. That doesn't necessarily mean that it is always going to be correct, but it adds a degree of, it's certainly, I think, more reliable than many other sites. So I was a little bit surprised that people said Wikipedia was more unreliable than something like Stack Overflow. And you can, and Wikipedia, I've just seen a comment from Hunter about the references, and I think that's a really good point, that Schrodinger's reliability as well. For people who don't know the reference to Schrodinger, it would be worthwhile going and looking it up. And those of you who are in Andrea's tutorial, you might want to ask her about Schrodinger's cast, unless you already mentioned it. The kind of comment about referencing in Wikipedia, I think, is interesting. One of the mechanisms that Wikipedia tries to use to improve its reliability is by ensuring that the information that's included is referenced and sourced appropriately, so that when you read it, you can, people often don't, but you can trace back to where that data came from and what the underlying kind of source of it was. So let me stop sharing that poll and keep going. I need to kind of wrap up fairly quickly. So different levels of information validity. You've got primary sources and secondary sources. A primary source, and so the validity of data depends upon whether it's a primary source or a secondary source, etc. So a primary source is, I collected the data, here is the data, and here's what it shows. A secondary source is, oh, I read this article, read an article by David where he talked about this data, and I think what he meant was. So it's where you've got a source that is kind of one step removed, and it's trying to do an interpretation of that. You can have expert opinions, an article written by Professor Smith, who has these qualifications and therefore is likely to be know what he's talking about, versus, oh, someone on the bus told me that Office 365 is better than G Suite. So you get kind of different levels of validity. And the way in which you need to, there's a whole range of things that help you evaluate the validity of those sources, the authority of it, where does it come from? Was it reputable? Has there been peer review associated with it? The suitability of the material. It might be valid, but is it relevant to my case? Someone sort of might, if I go back to that Office 365 versus G Suite example, Office 365 is definitely a better solution for G Suite based on these arguments in this context. And you read the arguments and you think they're well argued and appropriate and well sourced and it all makes sense. But when you read it, it says for this purpose, and then you look at your company and says, oh, well, actually our company's a bit different from that. So maybe the information might be valid within one context, but not valid in another. And is it sufficient? Does it kind of give appropriate coverage? And then I mentioned before about, does it need to be valid? If I'm looking for something about how to do a Git merge, and I find, I do a quick Google and it says, oh, I'll do this. And I say, oh, okay. And I do it. Oh, that didn't work. Oh, that source mustn't have been right. Let me go and look a bit harder and find it. So in a case like that, where you can kind of test it quickly, and find out for yourself whether it's correct or not, it probably doesn't really matter whether it's valid or not. It's giving you an idea that you can try, etc. If I'm going to base a major business decision on it, if I'm going to go and spend, huge amounts of money implementing a CRM system for my company, then I need to be pretty confident about the information. So there's also different levels of validity that become important. And referencing. One of the key things, and this got mentioned in the with reference to Wikipedia, but any source of any kind of basis is about how do you show where that information came from, so that you can actually test it and make sure it's valid. In your project, we will want you to reference your sources of information so we can go back and find them. And that means using references that do allow us to find them. And APA, there's lots of different ways of doing that. The one that we'll get you to use in this unit is APA. So you'll need to go and look up and see what that means and what the format of APA is. It's now 8 o'clock. I've said just about everything I wanted to say. I took a little bit longer. So why don't we have a break for 10 minutes, let you stretch your legs and get a drink, and then at 10 minutes past 8, Glenn will, I'll switch over or hand over to Glenn, and he'll talk to us about how to make some more sense of the things that I've been talking about. So thank you, and we'll see you in 10 minutes' time. I stopped that so that the chattering on wouldn't get recorded for the class. Welcome back, everyone. For those of you who disappeared and just came back, you would have missed Glenn and I just blathering on. For those of you who stayed online, hopefully, I don't know whether you found that interesting or tedious, but nevertheless. So I'd like to introduce Glenn Smith. Glenn has been an enormous asset in our university for a long time, and every semester he comes in and gives a guest lecture in various of our units. But he's an academic liaison librarian, so he works in the university library. And so whilst I can kind of talk to you a little bit about information and the nature of it, etc., this is really Glenn's absolute area of expertise. So I might just hand over to Glenn and leave you in his capable hands for a little while.
Thanks, David. So if you were listening to us talking, we talked about independent learning, and with information seeking and my game, it's really about getting you to play around so that you can become familiar with sort of information seeking tools and the range of those so that you learn them. Essentially it shouldn't actually take very much instruction. It should, involve play with a little bit of direction. So that's what we're going to look at today. But before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the owners of the land which I am on. I'm on Dharawal country. This part of Dharawal country belongs to the Wadi Wadi people. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So if we turn to what I'm going to just cover, we're going to look at some scholarly databases, tools for finding other types of information. So sometimes, David talked about journals, book chapters. I'm not sure he really emphasised conference papers, but sort of lump that in. And I sort of differentiate that with sort of tools for finding other types of information. David mentioned Gartner as well. And so we'll have a look at a bit of that. I won't look at Gartner. At the moment, Gartner seems to be restricted to staff only. And we're looking to sort of improve that, but there's no point me with a really practical workshop getting you to look at it because you'll be frustrated. So what I would do is encourage you to join in, play around with me, follow along when we look at those tools. And we'll just finish with maybe a recap. David sort of covered evaluating information, but that might be a good opportunity to just remind you of the importance of that. So depending on how long I've got, sometimes I'm a bit ambitious with what I try and cover in these sessions. So forgive me if we don't get to all of them, but we're going to start with ACM Digital Library, and I'm going to cover a couple of others there that you can see, time permitting. So one of the things I'd also just say is you're welcome to ask a question. I definitely encourage that, but we're going to use Menti at some point as well. So rather than post into the chat, we'll use Menti so that the responses are shown in a sort of way. But also be patient with me as well because I have to formulate quite a few searches here. Sometimes it's just a bit clunky, but we'll see how we go. I'll try our best. Okay, so hopefully you're familiar with the library homepage, right? There's so much information here, and it can be overwhelming. I'll just point out really the main search tool here initially, which allows you to search across what the library subscribes to. So that, it says search books, articles, and more. Essentially, the library pays for subscriptions to a range of different sources and tools, and this is sort of a large index that allows you to search across those subscriptions. But we're going to skip that today, and I'm going to show you databases. I'm sure some of you have used databases as well, but for those that haven't, it's time to get into it. So if you know the name of a database, you can just see I've done recent searches here. I go directly to them, but it's worth considering the fact that just because a database is aligned with a field that you're not interested in or you're not studying doesn't mean that it's not going to come in use for you. So with information and information seeking tools, we just need to consider what might be the best tool or tools for the context in which you're acting in. Okay, so for you automatically might go to information and computing sciences as a list of databases, and I can do that, and it gives me some key databases and then a range of others. But if I'm thinking about some other context, look at this, business information systems is listed under business, and there'll be some overlap and there'll be some differences about these key resources. So the top one, because it's alphabetical, is ACM Digital Library. So let's start there. So ACM Digital Library allows you to search both the ACM publications, so they produce a range of journals and other books, but they also allow you to expand. They have their own sort of larger index of computing. Right, so generally speaking, when you search the ACM Digital Library, you're going to get full text. If you expand that search, you're likely to get a range of full text and sort of just citations, maybe abstracts, right? So you don't always get the full text, but it's sort of very specific. Now, it's got a basic search just like any database, but you can also browse. So have a look at the journals. There might actually be something that's quite aligned with the topic that you're after. You can see the range of publications. So these are a mix of, journals that are under different disciplines, but obviously related to computing and information technology. Right. So you can search just within those publications, but I tend to show people the advanced search because it just gives you a bit more powerful, and if it's good like this, it'll give you how to actually go about constructing your search, and as computer science students, you'll know about syntax and how different databases allow you to create search strategies that return more results or fewer results depending on the syntax that you use. So you can see I start here, it's searching the full text collection. Now, if I construct a search, it's going to allow me to search the full text by default. Now, this is going to probably give me quite a broad range of things. Now, let's say if I'm using a computing aligned database and I search for something computing, I'm likely, right, let's say I want information technology, search as a phrase, so the words appearing together in the results. Just hit search. I'm likely to get a lot of results, right? So 37,000 results. And that's not surprising, right? Because I've actually, I'm searching along like a key piece of information for this database. But you can see here I can go even bigger. I can expand my search to the guide to computing literature, which is a lot bigger index if I'm not finding enough results. But one option that I have is to sort of improve my search. So I'm just going to pull together a search. So when I run these searches, I've just sort of plucked themes from course material that I've seen. So, I'm going to search things like human resources or change management because these are some of the focuses that you're looking at through the course. Okay, so if you're wondering where I'm getting these examples from. So I might run human resources or HR. So I'm searching both uses of those words to try and cover the different ways that people might refer to it. So I can obviously add others. And I might just search the abstract rather than the full text because I want it to be focused on that. I can put in another line and I'm going to look at sort of human resources in business, the context of business. So I go abstract again. So you can see here. So I've used the tips on the right here to sort of formulate my search. So I've got, because I want S or Z for organisation, I've got a question mark and I've got business so that I get business or businesses. All right, and the last one I might use is, let's have a look. You can see I've sort of looked at this sort of stuff before. So there's no point me using the word IT because the word it isn't going to be much good to me, but I could use, right, and I'm going to keep that broad. It's prompting me for cookies. Okay, and so I can like I tend to just run the search and then I'll apply filters later. So you can see here, well, that looks really good, but you can see as well that it's over 20 years old. So the first thing I might think to do is of course, limit it to a period, a more recent period, 10, 5 years, so that it's current and up to date. Right, and then I get some of the results. So there's a couple of things I'll show you on this. So I can see who's or how many citations it has attracted by clicking on these metrics. Obviously, I can access the PDF. Now, one thing I would show you that you need to do sometimes is so that you only get full text, you might actually want to reduce it to PDFs because even though it's meant to be searching the full text, you might find actually that there's some relevant material that's only citations, but you can see that it's restricted to PDF. Now, I'm going to take a step back because even though I created this sort of complex search, right, actually, if I'm after human resources related to computing, there aren't actually, if I think about it, this isn't a human resources database, right? So what I would actually probably do is go back to my search. And instead of just creating a complex search, I would just hit search, right, for human. That's not searching. Oh, that's all. That's why. Sorry. So not anywhere, but maybe in the title, right? Because I want the focus to be. Right. And so this is what I'm teaching here are sort of the conventions of any database, right? So there's actually only 51 results within ACM that are really specifically about human resources, right? And you can see that there's a range of things and there'll be even fewer results. So you can see what I did is that I took the focus, which is not necessarily around computing, it's a different focus, but it obviously it's where it meets with technology. And because I'm using a technology database, right, I'm not actually going to get that many. So even though I can construct a sort of detailed search as a librarian, in this case, I might not. But, if I wanted to search for artificial intelligence, I would need to probably construct something that's a bit more specific because there are going to be so many results in this sort of database. And you can see the types of things, right, I can look by content type. So, when we're talking about like really reliable types of information, I might want to start with a research article, right, because it's supported by all the things that David mentioned were important in terms of the reliability of information. So what I want you to do yourself now, if you haven't already, is I'm just going to run an activity. So if I go back to my results. So what I want you to do is I want you to construct a search within ACCM Digital Library. So entering it, going to the advanced search, and try and run a search for sources that explore how technology adds value to an educational organisation. So what you have to do here is pluck out the keywords and maybe any synonyms for technology, just like I did with human resources or HR. And I'll put my example back up in a second. But then I want you to actually come here and enter how you constructed that search. Okay, so if you go to menti.com, type in this code, right, and then we'll just see how you constructed that search. Run the search, play around with it for a bit. I'll just give you a couple of minutes to do that, and then just copy and paste your search string into this question, and then we'll just have a look and see what people got up to. Sorry, back. Oh yeah, sorry. Let me put the code back on. Some of you are already there. Sorry, yep. Put the code in the chat for anyone who doesn't read it. Doesn't want to enter it from site. Okay, we've got a first result so far. Yeah, I should show that pathway again. So, because David's put a link in, but it's with that easy proxy part in the middle of the link, it often breaks. So just be wary of that. I tend to show pathways because it gives really stability to URLs, but because of the UniKey authentication process. So library website databases, and then you just type it in, ACM, digital library, or just ACM would be sufficient. Right, you can go through there. And you can see how in my status bar that the easy proxy sits at the front. Right, so I've heard a comment which is Menti might be taking off the stars, but that's all right. We can assume that there's stars in there. So we've got technology, and I imagine that someone intended to have stars and value and education, right? So those are the key terms that are from the question. So then you might think of synonyms for technology, like another word for value might be benefit. when we're talking about an educational organisation, as someone has done already, we might then have synonyms like the context, which is like a university, or a secondary school, or we could search by the specific type of educational institution as well as educational organisation. Now I'll just point out this one where someone's put a star within quotation marks. So one thing I would say is, if you don't know the syntax well, you're likely to get into trouble and you might be better off leaving it. So we use quotation marks around a phrase, so which pushes words together. So only words, like this example here, which is educational organisation, the words need to appear together in the results. And the star tends to be at the end of a word, so that we get suffixes, different suffixes. So Australia is a good example. So if I put Australia star, I'm going to get Australia, but Australian, Australians. Okay, we've got benefit, yeah, as well as value. Terrific. Okay, if you haven't, if you're still playing around, just throw what you have in your search there and just see what. Yeah, good, technology and educational. Yeah, so this one here in this blue square is a good example of how the syntax works, right? So if I'm getting too many results, what I want to do is add a major different concept, right? So as well as technology and educational organisation, I might need another one. Now, there's no point doubling up on education, but at least the syntax is right here. So someone here is almost writing like it's language, right? Technology, add value to education. So strip out those little words like tos and its and those. You don't need to put those terms in your search. It's not going to search across those. So strip that out. Just think about the key terms. Yep, someone's put structured theirs within brackets, which is great. Okay, so that's a good start. So just what I would say to that is use those sort of tips that are alongside a database. Sometimes you have to go to the help section of a database, but also just start playing with that, right? And see how changing your search gets you different results. Use the filters on the left, right? I'm not going to necessarily look at the sources. Oh, maybe we should. So let's just, you can even see the types of things we have even, right, so if we have a look, hopefully you're familiar with the sort of standard format, right? But within here, often you have a literature review, not so much maybe with computing, but there might be a literature review, but it's labelled something else. So they're contextualising their own research. Usually you have things like the methodology of the research, right? In this case, there's a proposition, right? And we obviously looking at references as well. So there's a level of transparency, and it allows the reader to investigate further some of the claims that the author is making, which is really important. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at a different database, right? And it's called Scopus. So library databases, if you know the name of it, Scopus. Now, Scopus is pretty heavily used within engineering and science, probably less to an extent. But I just want to contrast it with something like it's quite a broad database for STEM. And so if I was to search, run that same search, which is human resources, if you remember all I did was search against the abstract. Right. The default in Scopus is article, title, abstract, and keywords. You can't search against the full text like ACM, so just understand that difference. But if I put that in and run this search, which is a broader index, I'm getting a huge number of results, right? You can see that the index, the pool of information is bigger. So if I go to ACM and I'm finding that the results are slightly maybe too technical, or I'm not getting any results at all, maybe I need to choose a different tool, and one that's sort of larger. One is that you'd be familiar with is Google Scholar. In this case, Scopus, or another one might be Web of Science as well. Right, so there's a couple of things that I'll just quickly show you here. Now, this is not a full text database, so you can see if you click on Find Full Text, it's going to search the library's holdings to see if it has it. I'll show you an example. Right, and it does the search, and it shows me the subscription in which I can access the article from. So it's not going to always be successful, but that's the mechanism for getting the PDF. Now, often I show this database because it allows you to do things like not only search within results, and obviously I'd want to create a better search than this, but I just wanted to show the contrast. Now, I'm going to run a search I ran earlier. Actually, I wonder if it's So another theme that you have to look at in the course is around ethics and sort of professionalism. So I'm going to run search ethics. Professional. So I'm getting ethic or ethics. I'm getting professional or professionalism or professionals. I want to add a new line, so we've got the and. So this is a different concept. It's going to reduce the number of results I get, right? So if I search just that, obviously it's going to show that in every single context that you could imagine. I want it in the technology field, so let's go tech sector. Let's put technology sector in there as well. Or tech industry, or let's say IT profession. Yeah, search. All right, and I'll get heaps fewer results, still probably too many, but straight away I might limit it to the number of results. Right, and obviously I'm getting it sorted by date newest to oldest. What I can do, sometimes I want the most impactful papers. I can change it to cited by highest to lowest. So it's going to show me the papers that have attracted the most citations. You can kind of see that 2021 papers aren't here because there's been no time for them to be cited. But, it's not a bad starting point, particularly when I have a lot of results. I don't want to read 240 results, so I'm looking for something that might be relevant, that at least I can sort of start with. So we talk about gender balance as an ethical consideration, racial bias in algorithms, it just depends on the theme. You can see the range. If I found I was still getting too many results, or I wanted to add a focus, a specific ethical consideration, maybe privacy, I could search within my remaining results. All right, it's just going to search the main thing. All right, and this is now I've got over a number of results that I can actually review. Okay, let me just check what I'm up to. So from here, so the one thing I wanted to say there is there are heaps of scholarly databases. So we start with those because, we're sort of emphasizing using reliable information. But there'll be some times when scholarly information, so journal articles, conference papers, books, book chapters, can't answer the question that you're after. So this might be because it's commercial information, case studies, it might be industry information, not always available, sometimes difficult to study as an academic, right, because of difficulty getting access to companies to find that information. So we offer some platforms that will provide different types of information that might help you answer certain types of questions. So if I go back to the library homepage, instead of databases this time, although I could get databases, I'm going to go to subject guides, right? Because these are sort of tools, information seeking tools, arranged in a sort of different way. So I'm going to go to business, and I'm going to go to company, industry, and country information. So you can see the list of the sort of tools and resources that we offer in this space are arranged according to maybe the need. So the first thing I'm going to show you, let's say you're interested in a company, and I think if I read, right, there's some need at some point in the course for you to investigate a company. So if you go to Company 360 as a database, so this is just a database that you can type in if you know the name of it. And I'll show you how it sort of presents information in a really different way to that previous database. So what we get here, and it's a little bit tricky to use, so I would encourage you to follow along, and I'll sort of step you through it. So what we sort of do here is we build a search. Now, if I know the company name, it becomes a little bit easier, but you can see I can search by a whole range of different fields. So I click on company name, it adds it to my search, right, and then I search for it. So at ASEAN, I'm going to look at the first one, right? I've got no idea why these are different, right? And I hit search. What it does is it gives me this company. So if I click through, it tells me a little bit of information there, but then it gives me all this sort of information. So this is just harvest, like what Company 360 have done is just harvest information as they've come across it, right? Like they've looked at company reports, they've looked at the stock exchange information, gleaned information probably from things even like interviews and press releases. Okay, and obviously they're constantly updating it where possible. So you can
remarkable bit of serendipity, Glenn. In week 1, we had a guest presenter from Atlassian.
Oh, really? Oh, terrific. Oh, well, that's pure coincidence, isn't it? So yeah, if I want to find out a little bit of information about that, it can be key financials, but also things like the family tree. So you can be a little bit confused potentially about how corporations and businesses are sort of arranged, and this kind of tells me that Atlassian Australia 1 owns a subsidiary of the same title, and even though they're ASX listed companies, it might be Microsoft, but Microsoft's Australian proprietary limited company, right? And so I can get a sense of it. All right, what industries? All right, so this is just a quick information a quick information seeking tool to get key pieces of information about the company really quickly. So what I would like you to do yourself now is turn back here. I want you to search for an Australian tech company in Company 360. So it can be a global company, you know, if you can't think of an Australian tech company. But it's just about getting you familiar with how to use it. Right, so go back here. Advanced search. So you come in on the advanced search page. So just have a go at that for me, and then enter what company you chose and how you got. So while you're doing that, I've got a question, which is, what is the difference between Scopus and ACM? So I'll try and make that a little bit clearer. So ACM, they're actually a publisher as well as providing an information seeking tool. So you can search across those publications that they produce. They also have an index of other literature that other publishers have produced, so you can expand your search to those publishers. Right, but it's really sort of honed in on the computing discipline. With Scopus, the index is much broader, so it's not just focusing on computing, and it's indexing information published by a large range of publishers. Right? So in terms of your use of those tools, you know, if you want something specifically related to technology, you go with ACM. If you're not getting enough results, or you want something with a broader context, so technology in the human resources field, for instance, you might need to turn to a broader index like Scopus or Google Scholar. Right? So it's essentially the size of the pool of information being indexed. Okay, so as well as entering the name of the company that you search for, tell me how you got there. Hopefully just following along with what I showed you, but if you tried a different mechanism, or, you know, one of the things I'm trying to get you to do is reflecting on the pathways of doing things, so that one, they stick, but two, so you have a better sense of the conventions of using these tools. Tried to find Smart Sparrow but couldn't. I reckon Smart Sparrow might be owned by another company, and that's the product name. So if I was searching for Smart Sparrow, which is a product, I might do a text search. Right, and I wonder if it's 2 words or one. So I'm searching for an exact phrase. So it looks to me like it's not indexed within this. So if I was searching for this piece of information, what I would do is I would go and use Google to find out the holding company for Smart Sparrow, like who made it, and then I would come in here and do another search. Now it might be that it's an international company without a local holding. Right, so there's no local corporation, local equivalent. Like obviously bigger global companies have local subsidiaries, but not not every company would. They just operate in that other country or provide that service to institutions in that other country. Okay, let's go back. What have we got? Anything else? Only 2. Okay, can I get you to enter before I move on? David tells me that they would be local. They were a UNSW spin-off. I wonder whether they're just not large enough to be listed in Company 360. It might just be that it doesn't fit in the pool. So if I wanted sort of tech startups, another tool that you can utilize is, if I go back to my subject guide here, I can look at Crunchbase Pro. So they're looking at startups and other innovative companies. Now, if you want access to that, you actually have to contact the business librarians for access, but we've got some certain number of licenses, but it's going to give you some tech, some startups, tech startups, where Company 360 is sort of broader in scope. Okay, Blackmagic Design. I feel like I know that. Do they make DaVinci Resolve, I believe, the video editing software? Okay, so let's keep moving on. You can kind of see why I might use something like Company 360. Now, if I go back a page, because this is just looking at ASX listed companies, I might actually want to look at industry information. All right, so this is going to give me a type of different source again. Still this will be secondary sources because it'll be analysis of the industry. So, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to show the pathway again. So library, subject guides, business, company and industry, country information, industry information. But again, if I just wanted to access IBISWorld, I could enter it into the databases and it would come straight. The databases search. So you can see we have a different platform again, and I can do a search here. I tend to browse in IBISWorld, so just showing you a different sort of approach. So we have reports. We have access to Australian, Germany, and global reports. So let's have a look at the Australian industry reports. And then you have specialised industry reports. So this is analysis done by someone that works for IBISWorld, that has, they look at sort of market research, they do interviews, they would sort of harvest information from wherever they can as well, like range of sources. Now IBISWorld is good, but you don't see the transparency that you'd expect from other types of sources. All right, so there doesn't tend to be a reference list. Now you can see all the different industries, and then there are sort of sub-reports. I'm going to look at hotels and resorts as an example. So this is the industry, but I'm interested in, I'm not so interested in the general industry. I'm interested in the technological aspect of it. So I can search within the report. Let's just keep it simple. And it pulls out the parts of the report that might be sort of, obviously that has the word technology and highlights that. So I can let's have a look at what they have here under operating condition. So it tells me about the level of disruption according to certain, I guess, what's the word? Themes is probably not the right word, but I can't think of a better word. But it also it has a lot of description, right? So, you know, as with overall accommodation sector, the emergence of Airbnb has seriously disrupted the hotels and resorts, right? You know, and it gives me some also information about how that affects the industry as well in terms of competition and operating conditions, right? The level of technology change is actually quite low, which is, you know, surprising really, but it will then justify it through its analysis, right? And then, you know, I can look at major companies as well, right? And it'll tell me the major companies in that sector, right? So it gives me a little bit of information within the report, but then I can also search Ibis World for that report, and it gives me a report specifically about the company and key details, a little bit like what we found in Company 360. So these will be mainly the largest key players that will be listed or will have their own report, right? Now, as I said, a lot of this information is just pulled from a lot of the different sources, but as a uni student, it saves you quite a lot of time. Okay, so I think in the last, just because I've got the last 5 minutes, I'm just going to show you two more things. So, like we've looked at sort of information seeking tools that are going to give us quite specific types of information, but I can almost guarantee you that a lot of you will have the temptation to just go back to Google, right? And while, you know, I could bang on about the fact that you shouldn't do that and you should revert, I just want to show you some things about Google that you might find useful, so that, you know, you're keeping that sort of reliable information thing in the back of your mind, using Google for its sort of power. So I'm just going to paste a search already done. All right, so, you know, that syntax that I employed in other databases works to some extent. The asterisk doesn't as a tool. It's no good. You can see I've got my keywords, but I've just done a couple of things. Right, so I want reliable sources. Now, in the Australian government, particularly the public service, produce lots of reports, right? So I've restricted it to a certain domain, which is the .gov.au site. So, you know, I could actually, if I wanted to, like that first result is AER. So if I only wanted to search the AER website, I could actually be more specific. And it's only going to search across a certain domain, right? So before I ran this search because I added the word training because I was getting all these things related to training, for instance. And, you know, for whatever reason, I wanted to remove training from those results. I was getting other things. So instead of using not, which is often a syntax, I just put the minus word in there. And you can see that I'm no longer getting results with the word training, which is great. Now, often things like case studies, for instance, you might want to find. So we could do instead of that, we could go, just put the word case study in, and often a reliable case study would be produced in the form of PDF, right? Because that's how reports and more reliable material often ends up being published rather than just blogs. So, you know, I'm going to remove blogs from my results here. You can see I'm getting university, getting IEEE, Emerald. I'm getting some good websites from restricting it just to PDF, and obviously, you know, my case study keywords as well. All right, so this is recorded, so you can go back and have a look at some of that syntax. But if you just search for Google syntax, all this will come up. And you can just see I'm eliminating those like opinionated blogs that really aren't necessarily reliable, that you need to be steering clear of. But I'm using the power of Google, right, which is a great search tool, but you know, I'm eliminating the unreliable sources from my searches, okay, which is important. So, whoop, that's the wrong screen. So if you recall, David talked about he's sort of mainly covered this, but let's say you're doing your project, your main assignment, and you've got a range of information that you've gathered, right? There is a criteria that you could apply. Like generally, I would run with more time. I would run an activity where you came back with that, but we're just going to recap because David's already covered it in the first hour. But just think about relevance. You know, is it the right type of piece of information for your topic? Is the focus relevant for you, or is it in a different, is it accurately, it's not talking about technology at all. For instance, it's talking about, just the hiring of someone into an HR role, if we go back to that human resources example. Expertise for the author. I often Google an author to find out their qualifications. So that's a quick and easy way of making sure that the author has expertise. Have they published before? The view of the author or organisation. So we just want to avoid bias. The Australian government, the public service, we know that they've tried to not necessarily influence. Can't say the same for politicians, and we can't say the same for other governments, right? So just be aware of possible bias. Who is the intended audience? Who is the piece of information aimed at? Is it for you people? Is it for students and professionals in the field? Or is it for someone that is, likely just learning how to use, a basic piece of technology, right? Not necessarily good for your context or need. Ease for evidence. So we're looking at transparency of, the methodology of the research, also for reference lists. And when is it published? So not everything has to be super up to date, but if nothing's changed, it might not be super up to date. But in computing, it's generally about the cutting edge. So often you'll be using sources that aren't very old. So don't go back too far, or risk the fact that things may have changed and you might be presenting something that is now outdated. So just be aware of that. So these are all very common sense things. So just keep them in the back of your mind and don't be tempted to ignore them because it's 3 a.m. and you think, I've got no other source but this random person's blog. Okay, take a step back, think about this sort of lesson and see how you go. Okay, I'm a little bit over, but that's me done.
Thank you, Glenn. That was fantastic. And as I said at the beginning, I think it kind of gave a sense that, comments in the first half were largely about kind of the broader concepts and information more generally. I think Glenn has given some fantastic tools for you to use in terms of finding sources of information, etc. I put a note into the chat window for the students towards the end, so when you were talking about some of those industry-focused databases, commenting that they have a project where they're basically exploring the adoption of a technology into a company that does some sort of process transformation or adds value to it in some way. And a key component of that is going to be understanding the nature of those companies and the context in which, the environment in which they're operating. And I think the sorts of tools that you were showing will help that process enormously. So I think that's been fantastic, Glenn. Thank you very much.
No worries. Yeah, and just on that information isn't always available elsewhere. So that's why we use those tools, is because they're someone's actually making money off gathering that information. So you can't just Google it. You won't necessarily find it. So draw on the tools where you can.
I think the absolutely worst part of giving talks like this online is the inability to really do an effective round of applause and thanks from the students, but I'm sure they appreciate it very much. So thank you, Glenn. And I'm distraught to discover that this is likely to be the last one. I was saying to Andrea and my tutors in a chat while you were talking that I need to find a way to convince you to come back and give talks for us in the future, despite not being at the university.
With pleasure.
But thank you. Everyone, just before we wrap up, a couple of very quick things. Let me share my screen, one slide, and then I'll let you go. There's a couple of quick comments. By now, all of your projects should be confirmed with your tutors. If you haven't confirmed them, then you are way behind schedule, and it'll be a sign to me that maybe your group isn't working properly, and I might need to look at shuffling your group around or splitting you up, etc. I won't do that immediately, but you need to get your act together. In particular, you should be trying to ensure that your topic is resolved in the next 24 hours. If I ask the tutors that it isn't resolved very soon, and they tell me it's still not resolved, then I'll be getting annoyed. But fortunately, the vast majority of you have got it sorted out. Based on the discussions in Ed, there still seems to be a little bit of confusion about the choice of technology in your companies. Just a reminder that the project is about saying how that technology might support the company. It's not about doing taking the company into a completely new area that's unrelated. So it's not about some change of direction. It's about saying we're operating, like that example I gave before of the pool company. They're saying, can we introduce a CRM? Or maybe could we use IoT, Internet of Things, sensors into pools to collect data for us? So something like that would probably involves more risk because it's not clear that it's feasible. I think there's a difference between a technology that's already commercially proven and you're just adopting it versus something that requires some R&D around it. It doesn't mean that the R&D ones aren't feasible, but it does mean that your project will be a little more challenging because you not only need to explore, this existing technology, how does it change us, but is it even feasible? And so just as a quick example of that to help you think about the implications of that, say you had a project where you said, the Sydney train operator, City Rail, has said, rather than having everyone having to have a Opal card to travel on the trains, we'll let them register we'll create a new online system, let them register, submit some appropriate photos, and then you can just walk onto the train and register your credit card details with the train network. And then you just walk on, it'll recognise your face and charge your card, or it will recognise you when you hop on the train and recognise you when you hop off and charge you accordingly. So there's a technology that is probably feasible. And there are lots of places that are using facial recognition already. So it's probably feasible. It would actually probably, if you could do it, it would be potentially valuable. But does it make good business sense? will it scare people? Facial recognition, you're tracking me, etc. So will it make people nervous? So it might be bad in that sense. And is the technology mature enough for this to be possible? It means that you would have a significant kind of technical risk associated with it. So that sort of project would be the very kind of limit of sorts of things that you probably want to be looking at. And so there's a spectrum of, we're a cool company, we're going to use an existing CRM, through to something that's much more radical. And a key part of this project is about exploring those issues. How does the business what business processes need to change? What are the risks? What are the potential value that it can deliver, etc. So over the next, now that you've got your project topics sorted out, they're the sorts of things you need to be thinking out over the next week or two, and in particular, using those sorts of resources that Glenn was talking about to start to kind of understand the context of your company. How does it operate? What's the competition doing? Are there other companies already kind of exploring that? Are there other companies who have tried it and failed, and it's created real problems for them, etc. So that should give you a starting point to begin thinking about some of these things. Other than that, let me just check that there wasn't anything urgent in the. Let me stop sharing my screen and check the chat window. No, there's no other questions other than a student wishing you best luck for the future, Glenn, in your new endeavours.
Very kind.
And thank you, everyone, and we'll see you all next week. And thank you again, Glenn. Very much.
Thank you. Sorry for going over.
Yeah,
Enjoy your evening.
not a problem at all. I think it's been incredibly valuable.
I'll see you around the traps.
Okay, thanks, Glenn. Night, everyone.